Good evening. My name is Thomas Bredol, and I'm the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Arts. And I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's 2016 Woodrow Lloyd lecture. At the heart of tonight's lecture is one of our nation's most pressing issues: the relationship between this country and Aboriginal peoples, and the legacy of harm this relationship has fostered. Tonight's lecture is also about truth, about understanding the full and painful truth, and about the necessity of finding a just way forward. It is a wonderful and heartwarming sight to see so many of you, to see such a large crowd gathered here in solidarity with this crucial task. And it is an especially great privilege to welcome the elders and residential school survivors in attendance here tonight. Please know that truth matters to us all. To open tonight's proceedings, I would like to invite live speaker Noel Stahl-Blanket of the Star Blanket Cree Nation to deliver a prayer. Ask you to deliver a prayer. Okay. Thank
you. We're all here to acknowledge reconciliation, and I would like to invite my dear friend whom I have met in the last 3 years, and we've become good friends. And in the interest of reconciliation, I'd like to invite him up to come and pray with me. Dr. John Meehan, would you please come up here? With the presence of the Honourable Justice Sinclair, and in front of the Honourable Justice Sinclair, who has called for reconciliation, John, I'd like to share this with you, if you would pray with me for the reconciliation amongst all people. And I also ask you all to join us in prayer, as I always say, the way that you know how, the way that you've been taught. And if you would do that with us, I would really appreciate that. If you'd like to stand. Hamamau yostawi mau. Asamina ninas kumana somatipska. Igwamina into temo netogamam. Hamate suichi egwa epixpata tana nusoma tipska umuta kiskin hawamato ikamek. Hamate suichi nanustawi mau. Igwamina into temo umuta. Dr. John Meehan naskum tin mina wista. Tamaxanan nistanan umuta. Mate siwichin egwa pematsawen pemaschiwen etuskewen papewiwen miomaschiwen kahkiau no kumagana nakumuta egwa mina kahkiau ato yagana mate se kagisamuta tana au ais kesuatsuna au kiau musumna no kumna mate siwichin egwa kehte yakumuta egwa mina kahkiau no kumagana nak mate siwichin Timax kahkiau musumna no kumna mate se kagisumuta tana au kiau au nete o tawi mau naskum tin kena naskum tin au Iko minan tu temu muta Ninaskumtin mina huista. Ego mina matei siwichinan kahkiau wakumaganana. Auk sipitama kuhtawi mau musumnanak no kumnanak. Ninaskumtin awau. Hai.
Thank you, Live Speaker Noel Starblanket, for so graciously opening tonight's proceedings with prayer. Each winter, the University of Regina Faculty of Arts is pleased to present an annual lecture in honor of Woodrow Stanley Lloyd, an educator and dedicated public servant of Saskatchewan. Tonight's lecture about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Canada, presented by the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, could scarcely be more timely and more relevant. As we gather here at the University of Regina, an institution situated on Treaty 4 and 6 lands. Just as we are all treaty people, so too is it our collective duty to bear witness to the disturbing legacy of pain and injustice that this history reveals. Education plays a crucial part in this pursuit, and therefore I think it's particularly fitting that this lecture also takes place at a university. To paraphrase the Honourable Justice Sinclair, it was the educational system that contributed to the problem of injustice. And it is the educational system that can help us repair it. Throughout his own life and his own life's work, Woodrow Lloyd's voice emerged as one strongly advocating education as an agent of positive social change. Lloyd began his career as a teacher. He was elected a member of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan in 1944, and then served as a member of education under Tommy Douglas. And in 1961, he succeeded Tommy Douglas as Premier of Saskatchewan. But it was in his 16-year role as Minister of Education that his lasting influence on education in Saskatchewan has been most keenly felt. Believing that regardless of where one lived, a student deserved equal access to educational opportunities and resources. Lloyd led the radical redevelopment of Saskatchewan's education system, including ushering in Canada's first system of student loans and bursaries, which would soon be implemented by provinces across our country. In 1963, Woodrow Lloyd laid the cornerstones of the first building on the Regina campus of the University of Saskatchewan, which is now, of course, the University of Regina. In recognition of his leadership in education and commitment to the public good, the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture was established, owing to the generosity of the Woodrow Lloyd Trust Fund. Each year then, a nationally or internationally recognized scholar, writer, thinker, and/or activist is invited to deliver the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture. And this lecture speaks to issues of direct relevance to our province, and in this case, indeed, to our nation as a whole. Past speakers have included social justice experts and activist Judy Rabeck, noted climatologist Elaine Wheaton, and author and indigenous leader Cindy Blackstock. I can think of no one better than tonight's lecturer, the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, to speak of the power of education, to shine a light on the injustices of the past, and to point the way forward for a more just future. I would now like to welcome Dr. James Deshak, an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Study, and author of the Governor General's award-winning book, Clearing the Plains, to deliver an introduction to the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to be asked to do this. Justice Sinclair, you're one of the most important public figures in the country, and I've really never done this before. So I did, in preparation for this, I did what any 21st century academic would do. I went to YouTube and watched a couple of your lectures. And I was lucky enough to find the Saul Canny lecture from University of Manitoba, where your son Nigan did a very beautiful introduction. So I won't live up to those standards, but I did learn a few things from Nigan. And one of the things, actually, I was sort of looking for some advice, and you provided it to me. What you said was you wanted your introductions to be succinct and accurate. Succinct? I can do that. I've got a lot of friends in the crowd. Accurate, I'll do my best. Now, one of the things is we just met in person. I just had the honor to meet Justice Sinclair in person this evening, but I've actually been following his career since I was a young grad student. I think we were chatting at supper. It was 1988, and it was just a few days before Murray Sinclair was appointed to the bench. And he gave a very interesting talk at University of Manitoba. And one of the things he talked about was the systemic discrimination in the legal system. And we talked about the story, and actually Justice Sinclair provided me with the name. As a young lawyer, Justice Sinclair had his Samsonite luggage, and he was all duded up, ready for court to represent his client. And the judge probably looked over his glasses, much like I do to my students, and just assumed that you were the defendant rather than the solicitor. And I think we've come a long way since then. I'm hoping, anyways. Since that time, you probably didn't spend very much time as a bench judge. Very soon after that, you were appointed co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. And that was on the news as a student in Winnipeg. I didn't have a television set. That was on the news on a daily basis for years. And actually, my colleague, Dr. Renee Fawcett, was one of your researchers, and she sends her greetings. And one of the things with the AJI, as we called it, was that you folks really took on the inequity in the justice system head on. And it was a very controversial and very brave thing to do. Also in your career, and as you said actually in that introduction, one of your introducers said that you were a very well-rounded person because your CV was so long. I'll try not to go through the whole thing. But during the late 90s, you were involved in the cardiac care crisis. There were more than a dozen children that died at the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg, a very prestigious hospital. And you got to the bottom of that issue, so congratulations on doing that. In 2001, you were promoted to the Court of Queen's Bench, I guess, which is a higher level. And you've won an Inspire Award, and I should probably give you some construction advice. You're probably going to be offered more honorary degrees. You'll probably have to build an addition to your home for all the honorary degrees you're going to get. Now, another thing I learned from Nigan's introduction was that your Anishinaabe name is, and excuse me for the pronunciation, Migaza Gijek, which means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. And also, Nigan said, was that part of your spiritual role was that you're the road keeper of the Three Fires Medewawin Lodge. And your task in that is that you keep the path in order, and you actually guide the people toward the lodge and help them on their way through their spiritual practices. I know that your culture is very strong, that your culture within you is very strong. You and your spouse established an Anishinaabe immersion daycare, which has been functioning for many years, and I know Nigan is a fluent Anishinaabe speaker. And you probably needed that spiritual power and that cultural power, because since 2009, you and Commissioners Wilson and Littlechild have heard almost 7,000 statements and interviews. Some may be some of the survivors here, and I acknowledge you and thank you for coming. In doing the difficult work that you and your fellow commissioners undertook, we all owe you a debt of gratitude, not just for the survivors whose pain and suffering as children was heard loud and clear, but all of us Canadians. Like, we have to thank you for that tireless work on behalf of the TRC, and you've got to be tired after that for sure, that opened the door that really can never be closed. And I was just chatting with my new friend, a psychologist, and we were talking about different theories of psychological theories. And one that came to mind was something called cognitive dissonance. I don't know, I haven't taken Psychology 100, but it's a theory based on the assumption that people seek consistency in their beliefs and reality. So if you believe one thing, there's sort of some consequences that go along with that. And I thought about that in the context of Canada. And really, we've become so accustomed to the notion that Canadians are the kindest, most decent, nicest people on the world, that when we see circumstances of undeniable injustice, Attawapiskat, La Loche, communities without drinking water, it's almost an instinct for some of us to think, well, it's got to be the communities. There's something wrong with the communities because that could never really happen in our country. Well, the work you've done has shown that in such stark light that we can't deny that anymore. And, it's such a deep discord with what we thought we were and who we really have been. Now, the testimony of the TRC has been broadcast, and for the younger people, maybe podcast over the last few years. And the reports you've commissioned have shown, often in excruciating, undeniable detail, that we haven't been kind, we haven't been decent, we haven't been nice, and that we have been contemptible and even criminal in our behavior. So in exposing our greatest shame as a nation, the TRC has probably made the most important contribution to the discussion of who we are as Canadians in probably the last generation. Now, some of you folks might be thinking, maybe the political scientists, really? Depth of contribution? Well, here's an idea. I was fortunate enough last year to be at Congress, and it was at the same time as the TRC came out. Congress, for those of you who aren't academics, is the annual migration of the professors, and we're going to have that migration, I think, in a couple of years. Well, I took the morning off and went over to the Delta Hotel, and there were so many people at the Delta Hotel. The street was lined with people, the lobby was lined, the main room was booked, but I got to get into the resource room up at, they had large television sets. And it was very moving. There were survivors there, the big TVs. And in between your presentations, the commissioners' presentations, this is an example of the depth of that discussion has moved. Such radicals as Paul Martin Jr., the former Prime Minister of Canada, talked about residential schools in the context of cultural genocide. Like, if you had, a week earlier, I never would have believed that he would have said those words. So that's how far, just the preliminary report, that's the impact that it's had. Now, we all needed to hear those findings. Those are truths that are undeniable. But you and the other commissioners have done so much more. With the 94 calls to action, you've challenged each and every one of us. That's each and every one of us in the room, each and every one of us in Canada, to do something. Now, maybe that's a family tradition, because the first time I met your son, Nigan, he was smoking a cigarette. You know he smokes, right? Okay. So, I think it was only one time. And I met Nigan, and we shook hands, and he's having a smoke, and it was at an Indigenous editors and publishers get-together. And he said, your book's pretty good, but you got to do more. And so we had a conversation like, well, I'm doing my best. And it was lucky for me that I'd just gotten back from a road trip where I'd given 5 talks in 3 days around Battleford at some of the reserve schools. So I was like, he chilled out on me. But, talking with Nigan, like, his voice is always in the back of my mind. In the last 2 years, I've probably given 100 presentations to school groups, different kinds of groups, and interviews. So that's, my small part I'm doing, with my limited skill set as a historian, I guess. Governments have responded to your calls. I spoke to Minister Ralph Goodale just at the beginning of January, and I was asking him how the federal government is going to rise to those calls to action. And what he said is, the federal cabinet has gotten around and people have parceled out each of those 94 calls to action. It's like, okay, well, that's my department, we'll get on it. So things are happening, and actually, more than people just getting onto it, just last week, Prime Minister Wynne of Ontario committed Indigenous training and education to every single member of the Ontario Public Service. That's hundreds of thousands of people. So things are happening, and it's to your credit, sir. Now, we as Canadians love to sit back and let the government do things for us, but really, as citizens, it's incumbent upon us to take this up as well. So, there are almost 100 calls to action. Everyone in this room probably has a call to action that's very close to their life and their work experience. So, we should rise to the challenge. And if you're really not sure about this, if this is still sort of an academic exercise or you really can't relate to it, I've just got a suggestion for you. If you have a car, take the car and drive 1 mile west outside of town in Dudney. Drive a mile north and you'll see basically a bulldozer cut. So you'll see a big pile of dirt in the field, then you'll see a fence, and you'll see a bunch of teddy bears tied to the fence, okay? I suggest if you can, it's pretty muddy right now, but if you have the time, get out of your car and take a walk around that yard, because that is the burial place of 36 children who are at the Regina, excuse me, at the Regina Indian Industrial School. Mr. Sinclair has been actually in discussions even today about having that graveyard, the resting place of 36 children, recognized. Well, we still haven't gotten around to doing that yet. So maybe that's something we as citizens can kind of get a move on and try to get some action on that. And so I think I'm losing the succinct part of this, but I just would like to conclude. And so, Justice Sinclair, you've come a long way. We've all come a long way when, the judge thought that you were the defendant. And we still have a long way to go. And, in my deep research on YouTube, I know that you had, one of your talks was entitled, "The Truth is Hard, but Reconciliation is going to be Harder." And I'm sure it's going to be a difficult, difficult journey, but I truly believe that things are changing. And that's, a consequence of your work. And just getting back to your name, maybe the pictures in the sky that the elder who gave you your name, in Anishinaabe, maybe that's a sign of what Canada can be. That's our ideal. And if we all work together, and actually, with your experience as the road keeper in the Medeowin, with the calls to action, you've shown us, the path to reach that goal. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your work, and I would like to introduce you to Justice Marie Sinclair.
Bonjour, Nikanastuk, Mizinigijik, and Dizinikas. Kego Dodem. Well, in the 5 minutes I have left, I want to begin by doing what I always do at events like this. If you don't mind and bear with me, I would like all of the survivors who are in the room and their children, grandchildren, and nieces and nephews who are here to please stand up. Thank you. I think of you always. I want to also acknowledge my friend Noel Starblanket for the words that he shared with us, as well as Dr. John Mahan for the opening prayer that they collaborated on. And I would also like to acknowledge all of the people who are the protectors of this territory, the ones who are the traditional keepers of this territory from Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 for allowing this place to be built and this event to occur, and for so many of you being here and participating in this event this evening, as well as in the dialogue that I hope will flow from it. I want to also acknowledge the tobacco that I've been given and say that it will guide me in my thinking for the evening. And Noel, I want to thank you for the smudge that you did with me this evening in order to prepare me for this time that we have together, for the 4 minutes I now have left. I have a video that I want to have you watch in a few minutes, but not yet. But I do want to, as a preliminary gesture, indicate to the survivors in the room that it's an intense video. It's a song written by a young man who's a survivor of the foster care system and a descendant of residential school survivors, who wrote this song for his family and for himself as well as for all of the people of his generation about what residential schools mean to him and the impact that the foster care system has had upon him. But before we get to the video, I just want to comment that because of the intensity of the video, some people may find it a little too intense. And so if you feel you may not be able to watch it, feel free to just step outside for a minute and let us share this with the others who are here who may not have seen or heard about this story. And I don't know that we have any health providers in the room, but if there are some of you who are here and experienced with providing care for survivors at times like this, if you see people who are in need, please help to take care of them, because it does sometimes have an impact upon them that is unpredictable and unknowable ahead of time. I want to begin by saying this as a preliminary comment. Probably the most important process that you will engage in, or that you have engaged in your life, is to answer the question about where you belong, about what it is that is the meaning for your life. Every society has an obligation to help our children to answer 4 very important questions that they all need to know the answers for, at least need to be guided in finding answers for themselves. Sometimes we never find those answers until the very last moment of our existence, but nonetheless, addressing those 4 questions during the course of our lifetime is a very key part of our ability to live, to relate, to deal with life, and to deal with others as part of our lives. And those 4 questions are: where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? Our society spends a lot of money through the public education system and through every other source of mass communication that we have in this society to help our young people and help each other to know the answers to those questions. And yet, for Indigenous youth, for many generations, literally from the time of Confederation until relatively recently, the ability to answer those questions has been impaired by the experience of residential schools and by the experience of the public school system as well. We must acknowledge that. And we also must acknowledge that it has also impaired the ability of non-Aboriginal children. All of you who are in this room as well have been affected by the way that our school system has educated us about Aboriginal people and about the history of this country. The things that it has ignored, the things that it has taught, the thoughts that it has reinforced have gone a long way to ensuring that we are able to continue to treat each other the way that we treat each other, that we continue to talk about each other and talk to each other in the way that we do. And so When you think about your public school experience, for example, what was it that you were taught about Indigenous people? What was it that you were taught about the Métis? What were you told about the Inuit? What were you told about First Nations? What were you told about the Cree? Did you know even where First Nations were located in your territory that you grew up in? Did you know who they were? Did you understand their thoughts and feelings as the European colonizers and explorers and settlers arrived in this territory? Did you appreciate what their thinking was when it came to the treaties and why they signed treaties that looked relatively simple and seemed to be bad deals? But did you understand the relationship between the treaties of today and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which the Crown of England announced to all of the First Nations and all of the Indigenous people of North America that the Crown would never interfere with the way that they governed themselves. They would never interfere with their territories until the First Nations people were ready to allow the Crown to do that. And so that message of non-interference was part of the thinking behind all of the Aboriginal leadership at the time of treaty. Most people don't know that. It's not taught in our schools. And yet, the fact that treaties exist is also not taught in our schools until relatively recently. While our young people today know a little bit about the treaty-making process and the importance of treaties, their parents don't, their grandparents don't, and so while some really would like to know more, there is very little in the way of public information available to them by which they can learn that and support their children in their thoughts. And we know that there are children who learn things in the schools through those classes who, when they go home, find themselves in positions of resistance from their parents who tell them that what they're being taught is wrong and that they need to stop thinking like that. So we have a long ways to go. Residential schools were with us for 130 years, and we need to understand that that's 7 generations of children who went through those schools. And not only were they going through the residential schools, they were also going through the public schools. And that 7 generations of children have caused the problems that we now see. And it may take us 7 generations in order to get to a point where the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is back in balance. So we need to learn to be patient. We need to learn to be committed. We have to keep our eyes on the prize, as the civil rights movement said. We need to understand that the end game is what's important. And therefore, I want to encourage all of you not to feel shame, not to feel anger, not to feel that you are somehow being left behind because others are more knowledgeable about this than you might be. Because you are, in the final analysis, making a contribution by being here, by listening to this session, by listening to what it is that has to be said, and by taking the message that you will hear from this process as well as from the video that you're about to hear and carrying it forward. This young man who is going to be featured in this video is a young man by the name of Aaron Peters. Some of you may know him. He's an entertainer from Manitoba. Back in 1992, I think, or 1993, I met him, and he was at that time a young man of just under 20 years of age. And he wrote a song called The Perfect Crime, or Perfect Crime. And it was a song about the way that Indigenous people have been treated in this country. And the opening line of the song is, "From unmarked graves, their bones cry out." And at the time, I thought it was a song about the foster care system which he was coming out of. But as we listened to it more and more, as part of our work at the TRC, we realized that it really was a song about residential schools. And so we encouraged him to reissue the song and to do a video around it, and we supported him financially so that he could do that. And this is the video that he produced as a result of our support. So I'd like you to watch it. So can we play the video?
graves, their bones cry out. Don't let what happened to us be forgotten. Indian hunters were paid for each scale by the government. You have nothing to be proud of, my white friends. It's your world. It's your world. And if ever there was a perfect crime, if ever there was a perfect crime, I grew up in an empty room, in a foster house full of strangers. Every dream I had about going home never ever did come true. Lie broken like the promises that litter every street and every alley in your and if ever there was a perfect crime, if ever there was a perfect crime, from ourselves we hide, from the darkness deep inside. You took away our pride, and you never know what you have from our graves, the bones cry out. Don't let what happened to us be forgotten.
Residential schools for the longest time were difficult places for young children to go to. It started out with a project in mind of taking young children away from their families and disrupting the transmission of culture and language to those children because the government believed that Aboriginal cultures and Aboriginal people were inferior people, and that their continued attempt to maintain a sense of identity that placed them separate from the rest of society was a threat to both Canadian unity and a threat to the desire of the government of Canada and the political leaders of the day to have a unified country going from coast to coast. there is no question but that the purpose of residential schools was cultural genocide. And when you look at the Genocide Convention, there is in fact a provision in the convention which captures perfectly the fact that the forced removal of children from their families and from their culture to be placed with people of another culture for the purpose of eliminating their culture, their race, is an act of genocide. And while from a legal perspective, it's conceivable that the Convention on Genocide does not apply to the government of Canada because most of the time that the government was undertaking residential schools, the Convention on Genocide didn't exist. The reality is that if the government of Canada or any other government in this world attempted to do today what they did in establishing residential schools and running them as they did, that they would probably be subject to the Genocide Convention and subject to world prosecution. That being said, however, prosecution of a perpetrator is not the be-all and end-all of the resolution and would not, in the end result, achieve reconciliation. The survivors of the residential schools who negotiated the residential school settlement agreement were interested in two things. They were interested in ensuring that the truth of their experience in residential schools came out. They wanted to ensure that the public was aware not only of what happened to them, but what the schools were all about and what the schools were trying to do. And that the effort of the schools did not succeed, not totally in any way, but it did have a large debilitating impact upon their lives and upon their communities. And it is interesting when one looks at the child welfare system to in fact recognize that what residential schools were really about was a child welfare system. They were not an education system. For most of the years that the residential schools were in existence, they didn't have qualified teachers. There was no requirement for there to be any qualifications for any of the teachers. The people who were brought in to teach were in fact limited to teaching them or providing them only with basic counting skills and basic reading skills and basic writing skills. But there was no effort to provide them with the kind of education that they could use in order to advance into a post-secondary career or to do some kind of professional work afterwards. That only came about after the Second World War in the 1950s, when the government, in fact, had made a decision in 1949 to get out of the residential school business, to close the schools down, and to move the children into the public school system. Beginning in the 1950s, the children in residential schools were still brought into the residences, but instead of being educated in the school portion of the residential school for their high school years, they were instead shipped out to the local public schools to be educated there. And the same effort of indoctrinating them into Canadian society was maintained in the public schools as well. Presentations were made to the government following the Second World War when the government was looking at changing the Indian Act and putting something else in its place, that in fact the government should be careful about undermining the progress that had been maintained to that point in time in the view of some, that children were being properly assimilated and that therefore the government should not totally eliminate its efforts to educate the children, because the children were in fact now being jeopardized if they were being returned to their families because the families themselves were becoming dysfunctional. There's very clear evidence that family dysfunction was a significant social problem for Indigenous families in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. That led directly to the scoop of the 60s when a lot of the children who were in residential schools were brought into the child welfare system and ultimately placed for adoption. We have found in the documents that we have uncovered in the archives of Canada evidence that agreements were put in place between those who ran the residential schools and local children's aid societies and child welfare organizations to move the children directly into the care of provincial child welfare agencies for the purpose of ensuring that they didn't go back to their dysfunctional families and into situations of neglect. And there's no question but that many families back in the home communities were incapable and unable properly to provide for the children. Poverty was rampant. There was very little in the way of economic activity, no opportunities for economic gain provided to Indigenous families. The government had deliberately maintained a policy of not providing any financial support to Indigenous communities, not providing them with any means of infrastructure for their communities, not allowing their communities to develop any kind of economic engines for themselves in their communities until the 1950s. And so as a result, unemployment rates were very high and people were forced to move. In the 1950s, the Government of Canada established an off-reserve housing policy to encourage people to move off the reserves into urban areas. If you lived in an urban area and you bought a house, the government would pay for the house for you and would forgive you the loan on the house if you lived there for 10 years. So you had to leave your community, move into an urban area, and they would give you a house. And they would not build houses, though, in the First Nations communities, but they would allow you to buy houses in urban areas. Off-reserve movement was a significant issue in the 1950s and 1960s. Friendship centers were formed and were funded for the purpose of assisting people to transit from their Indigenous communities into urban areas. And the government paid lots of money for those programs that were needed for that to happen, because the government was determined to continue their policy that they had started through the residential schools of not supporting children and families back in their communities, but instead moving them into provincial jurisdiction and subject to jurisdiction that was not part of the equation when the treaties were signed, were not part of the discussion and the dialogue. And so all of that was a deliberate breach of the treaties and the negotiations that had gone into the commitments that were made back in the 19th century. But what does all of that really mean in this day and age? And I think that's the question that many people are asking. What is it that we now do about this? We have pointed out that when you look at the evidence that's accumulated during the course of our work at the TRC, as well as the evidence that's come out through the compensation hearings process, it is clear that a substantial amount of abuse occurred in the school, but it's also clear that a substantial number of children were not physically or abused in the schools or sexually abused. Less than 50% of the people who went to residential schools were subjected to some form of physical or sexual abuse. Reality is, though, that every child who went to a residential school was abused in some way, emotionally or mentally, because they were taught that their people were inferior, that they were heathens, they were savages, that they were dirty, and that there was no hope in maintaining their identity, and that their only hope lay in becoming part of Canadian society and giving up their Aboriginal ancestry. And that message became part of the message within Indigenous families as well. I never went to a residential school. I was raised in a community out of a reserve, and I went to the public school system. And I can speak from experience about how the public schools educated Indigenous and non-Indigenous children in this country. And I can tell you it was not good for us. It was not good for me. I graduated from the school near the top of my class. I was the athlete of the year. I was the valedictorian of my graduating class. I received a substantial amount of scholarships and financial awards to be able to go to university. But the one thing that I really needed were the answers to those 4 questions that I didn't find in the public schools, because the public schools didn't provide those answers for me either. Public schools, in fact, tried to teach me and tried to teach all Indigenous people that my only hope lay in becoming part of Canadian society, in assimilating and giving up my sense of self, my sense of identity, my sense of where I belonged and what I belonged to and who I was. When I graduated from high school, I was not able to say, I am proud to be Anishinaabe. I was not able to say that. In fact, I was ashamed to be Anishinaabe. Like many of my generation in the public schools at that time, we hid that fact as much as we could. We used to tell people we were French, we were Spanish. We'd make up all sorts of lies in order to overcome the fact of our Aboriginal ancestry, because we didn't want to admit that. I don't want to ask for a show of hands here, but those of you who are of my generation, who went to public schools in the 50s and 60s, you know what I'm talking about. There were lots of people who hid their Aboriginal ancestry, not only from others, but also from yourself. And even when you wanted to find the answers to those questions about where you came from, about what your particular history was, you never found it in the schools. I remember when my son was born, when Nigon was born in 1976, and I went in search of answers to be able to give to him some sense of who he was and who he was going to be and what his history was. I couldn't find anything. There were no elders in my community that could pass on that information, at least none that I was able to find. Most elders, in fact, still kept that information hidden. My grandmother, who raised me, taught us, even though she could speak Cree, Ojibwe, French, and English, taught us that we could only speak English in the house when we were at home. And I asked her one time, why did you do that? Why did you not allow us to continue to speak Ojibwe? Because I could speak it when I was a little boy. And her answer eventually was, as she got older and later in life, her answer eventually was, because I wanted to save your life. That's why we didn't want you to speak the language. And I didn't understand that. Even then, I didn't understand what that meant, because I didn't think anybody would kill me for speaking Ojibwe. But what it meant was this. She had been raised in a Catholic school. She had spent her whole life in a Catholic residential school. She had been taught to believe that if she continued to practice her language, her culture, if she lived as an Indian person, that she was going to go to hell. And if her children were raised that way, and if she raised her children that way, then they were going to go to hell too. And hell was permanent damnation. And she didn't want us to spend eternity in damnation in hell. She wanted us to be able to go to heaven, where she thought she would be. She wanted to save our lives, in other words. And so that was the reason for the rule. And that's the reason why a lot of parents didn't teach the language to their children, and why so many young people today are unable to speak their language. Because their parents not only were discouraged, but felt emotionally and mentally traumatized at wanting to and being able to give them that language, because they thought that they were doing them more harm than good by doing that. And that's sad. It's sad that that happens. It's sad that we have so many of our young people today who are caught up in the child welfare system, are caught up in the provincial jails and the federal penitentiary system as well, attributable to the fact that they have come out of these dysfunctional home situations created by Canadian society, created by residential schools. I did a presentation to ministers of child welfare a number of years ago, and they asked me, what's wrong with the system? And I said, we do not have enough time for me to give you everything, but let me say two things. One is the child welfare system is based upon a financial model that is totally wrong. It's based upon a financial model which only rewards agencies for taking kids into care, and therefore there is no financial incentive for them to support families before the kids come into care. And as a result of that, they only make money if they take a child into care. But that's only part of the problem. So the other part of the problem is that the child welfare system is created by governments which have themselves created the dysfunctional families to begin with. And it's like, in fact, going to the perpetrators and asking the perpetrator to save you. It makes no sense whatsoever. The perpetrators are incapable of saving us. The perpetrators are incapable of saving Indigenous people, because the perpetrators are the ones who believe in the Kool-Aid that they have been drinking for all these years. And as a result of that, they do not see that they have yet done wrong. They do not yet accept that they have done wrong. They do not see that the child welfare model that they have in place is a model that is not going to solve the problem for Indigenous people. We have to figure out a better way a better way based upon our own traditions and our understanding of family and family function that will allow our families to continue to take care of their children, even when the parents themselves are unable to. Child welfare has been an issue for us going back hundreds and hundreds of years. We know that. There are reports back in the Jesuit relations in the 1600s about what happens when a young woman gives birth to a child and is incapable of raising the child. Well, they didn't come and take that child away and ship that child off to another reserve down the road or ship him off to Toronto or ship him over to Europe. The grandparents intervened. Grandparents took the child and then would designate one of the other family members to raise that child. And that's what happened with me. My mother died when I was a year old. And my two grandmothers, my mother's mother and my father's mother, they got together and decided that they would raise us. And that initially I went to live with my mother's mother, but because my mother had just died, she was unable emotionally to take care of us. She was still grieving. And so my father's mother, my grandmother on my father's side, she took us in. She was 63 years old. My grandfather was 70 years old. I was a year old. My baby brother was 13 weeks old. My sister was 3 years old. My oldest brother was 4 years old. Can you imagine? In your 60s, taking in 4 children under the age of 5? She thought nothing of it. And you know why? Because she had 8 daughters, each one of whom, and 2 of whom sometimes, were dedicated to being our caregivers. So I grew up with 2 mothers and a grandmother in one house. So did my brother. 2 different aunties took care of him. And my sister the same. Because that's the way it happened in those days. My grandmother was still the matriarch. She was the one in charge of it all. It was like a military unit every morning and every evening. But she was the one in charge of it all because that's how it was done in those days. And that's how it has always been done. The children were always taken care of by the families. But when you come from a society which believes only in the nuclear model of families, the mother, the father, the children, and has no room for thinking about grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives, and you come from that thinking that they're not to be involved and they have no greater role than anybody else, you're not thinking about the child. You're not thinking that that child needs to belong to somebody who will give him a sense of self, give her a sense of identity, give them a sense of where they belong and what they belong to. That's why the child welfare system is not only failing our children, but will continue to fail our children until that is changed. No matter how much they tinker with it, it's never going to work, and it needs to be changed. But on top of that, we have the jail system. We have the jail system which continues to incarcerate our people in huge numbers. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, which had 70% of the residential schools going back to the 19th century, has an average of 70% provincial populations being Indigenous people. It's higher for women. Almost 90% of the women who are locked up in the prairie provinces are Aboriginal women. About 80% of Indigenous youth locked up in the prairie provinces are Indigenous youth. And it's because the child welfare system has failed to protect them. Almost 3/4 of the people locked up in our prisons are graduates of the foster care system. So why would we continue to give children to a system that fails them in that way? And I was talking to family court judges not that long ago, and I said, if a family came to you and said, we'll take in some more foster kids, and you looked at their history and you saw that when they took foster kids into their house, that 3/4 of the foster kids that they went to live with them ended up in prison, would you give them any more kids? Of course you wouldn't. So why do you do that with child welfare agencies? Knowing that they're going to fail 3/4 of our children. Because the model is wrong. The system is not working, and we need to change the system. And putting more money into the system will help solve some things if it is intended to front-end the work of the agencies by ensuring that support programs are put in place to prevent children from coming into care. But the reality is that if that is not the model that's going to be the result of additional funding, the model is still never going to work. You can put all the money you want into paying for foster care, but it's not going to work because children benefit from being within their families, from being within their communities, from being raised to know where they come from, to know where they're going, to know why they're here, and to know who they are. And if we can address things that way, then we will be able to address the issue of those large numbers, which are going to become more and more of a financial burden upon society as we grow, because our population is growing immensely. Take a look at the numbers. Our birth rates are really very high. We are outstripping the non-Aboriginal people of this country at a rate of 2 or 3 to 1. Within a few generations, not only will we be a significantly higher proportion of the population, but we will be a significantly higher proportion of the prisons in the child welfare system. And who's going to pay for that? The taxpayers are going to pay. And if the taxpayers are going to pay for that, then it's because they have picked the wrong model to begin with. We have to fix this system before it gets too far out of hand. It's already out of hand. We have to stop it from becoming even worse down the road. On top of all of that, we also have to recognize that the way that we incarcerate and what we do with people that we incarcerate, and the fact that we incarcerate so many people also needs to be addressed. And those are immediate problems. Those are short-term issues that need to be addressed. In the long term, we need to change the way that we talk to and about each other. And that's why the real key to reconciliation is our education system. We need to change the way we educate ourselves. We need to change the way we educate children in this country, because if we continue to educate children in this country as we have educated children in the past, then we will continue to develop governments that will maintain the policies of the past that are not working for us, who will believe in the Kool-Aid that their generations before them have been drinking for so long, who believe that punishment is the key instead of prevention. And we know that that's not going to work. We know that we have to figure out a better way of doing things. And it begins by understanding each other better, so that when we have conversations between our leaders at the national level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, and at the international level, that those leaders are able to talk to each other in a respectful way because they know where each other is coming from, instead of it being such a one-sided conversation. And it will also change the way that we think about reconciliation. Reconciliation is a difficult concept to get your head around. It has dozens and dozens of possible interpretations, dozens and dozens of possible meanings. To an accountant, reconciliation is about making sure that the numbers in this column match the numbers in that column. To a lawyer, reconciliation is about whether or not you're ever going to get back together again. That's all it is. They don't care whether you're going to live in peace or not. All they want to know is if you get on the stand and you say you might reconcile, that means you're not going to get a divorce. And they might not get paid. And so they're a little concerned about that word too. But reconciliation has a special meaning in that dialogue, in that context. Reconciliation between the church and its parishioners also has a very unique feature. In the Catholic Church and in some of the other Christian churches as well, they have a doctrine of reconciliation which says that if you commit a sin and you admit that you committed a sin, that if you do the penance that you are told to do, that you are entitled to be forgiven. In fact, you must be forgiven. I was watching a documentary about the perpetrators of violence and abuse on boarding school survivors in Alaska. And I was watching, on the documentary, I was watching one of the church leaders of the Catholic Church in Alaska delivering a sermon to members of the Aboriginal community in Alaska. And he said to them very clearly, "We admit that our priests have abused you. We acknowledge our sin. Now you must forgive us. If you do not forgive us, you are going to hell." So how can they get it wrong, right? They issue an apology, they admit they're wrong, and now they must be forgiven. Forgiveness is not necessarily part of reconciliation. I've told people that many times. And you really can't forgive a church anyway. You can't forgive a church or a government any more than you can forgive a car that runs you down in the street. Right? It's a driver. That's the one that you must think about. Are you ready to forgive the driver? If the driver has done something wrong, that's the question. But the real issue is, are you able to come to terms with what's happened to you in a way that allows you to move forward in a healthy way? Are you able to shed yourself of the anger that comes from that event and be able to live a healthy life? That's the question. And if you are able to do that, then reconciliation doesn't mean that you have to forgive anybody. I preside in domestic violence court a lot when I was doing regular work as a judge. And I always used to say to victims of domestic violence, you do not have to forgive this man for having abused you. You do not have to forgive him. If you want to continue to have a relationship with him, you have to figure out how to have a relationship with him because you have children. You obviously have to have a relationship. But you have to continue to have a relationship with him that doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness, but prevents you from taking out your anger on the children while that relationship continues. So you have to address your anger. That's really the issue. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chairman of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, writes a lot about forgiveness. And because of his training as a clergyman, he believes in the importance of forgiveness, but at a personal level. He says, forgiveness is important for you as part of your own healing, because it allows you to put down that anger. It allows you to be able to move forward with your life without carrying the burden of that anger going forward. And that's true for many people. Sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to be able to forgive in order to be able to move on, particularly if you want to have a relationship with somebody into the future. But the reality is that if you're not intending on having any kind of a meaningful relationship, you don't have to forgive them, but you do have to find a way to put your anger down. Because if you continue to live an angry life, if you continue to carry that anger and use it in the course of your living as in the future, then you will harm others and you will harm yourself. And that's my message to survivors and to their children. You have to learn to put that anger down and do something about that. Because if you do not, then the children and grandchildren, the children of the future, are going to continue to be victimized by residential schools through you. And we cannot continue to have that. Reconciliation requires that we think about the children 7 generations from now and ask ourselves the question, what kind of world do we want to give to them and how are we going to get there? And from the perspective of those who have been victimized by these schools, by the events of the schools, and by those of us who have been victimized by those who were victimized, the survivors of the survivors, we have to be realistic and say to ourselves, we cannot carry that anger around anymore. We have to figure out what we can do about it in a positive way for ourselves, for our own healing, without forgetting. We must never forget what happened. That's why for us at the Commission, grabbing all the documents and requiring the documents be provided to us as was promised in the settlement agreement was so important. As part of our work, we felt it was important to create a national memory around residential schools, so that in 50 or 100 years from now, or 3 or 4 or 5 generations from now, no one would be able to deny the events of these schools. No one would be able to deny that the schools were abusive to these children. No one would be able to say that residential schools were a good idea gone bad. Residential schools were never a good idea because they were always intended to be places of harm, and they should never have been created for that purpose. Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with residential schools per se. You can create boarding schools which are positive experiences for people and ensure that the children who are provided an education through that kind of an environment are properly educated and treated in a respectful way. But you have to work hard to make those institutions work that way. And that's very challenging. A lot of people don't know how to do that and are not aware of the problems that go into doing that. And for many of our First Nations communities and our Inuit communities and Métis communities who are in remote and rural parts of the country, sometimes getting an education can only be accomplished by sending kids away to go to school. And in those situations, we have to ensure that they are in a safe place. Whatever it is that they are placed into, whatever kind of an institution we send them to, going to treat them in a safe way. So I'm not opposed to residential schools per se. I am opposed to residential schools being created for the purpose of indoctrination. But I am not opposed to residential schools that are created for the purpose of education and providing children with a means to be able to answer those 4 questions. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? Those 4 questions are basic to every individual's need, and we have to ensure that it is respected and protected in everything that we do. There's a lot more to be said about reconciliation, and I've written a 5,300-page report. And I've only covered 12 pages here, so unless you want me to keep going on and on and on, I think maybe I'm going to end my remarks there by saying that we have a lot of work to do, us. We have a lot that we need to consider as we go forward. We need to make a commitment to reconciliation. We need to make a commitment to doing something about this, to doing something in a positive way. When we first started the work of the Commission, the most common comment that we received from people were, I didn't know any of this. Why was I not taught this in our schools? That was not something that ultimately was going to be a useful question to ask, but towards the end, a very useful question came out that we do address. And that question towards the end, the most common question we got at the end of our work as a Commission is, what can I do about this? What can we do about this? So let me give you some suggestions. It's really very simple. Read the report. At least read the summary of the report. And if you can't read the summary of the report, because I tell you, for a summary it's 500 pages long, and that is a big summary. But I'll tell you a little secret. There's a 100-page summary of the summary. So read the summary of the summary, at the very least. But even if you can't do that, read the calls to action. Look at the calls to action. Because the calls to action are directions to you about what it is that you can do, about what it is that this society needs to do. And when you have done that, pick one. Pick one. And work to make it happen. Do what you can to make it happen. If it's the child welfare ones, work with people in your community to ensure that the child welfare calls to action are implemented. If it's the one about education, work with your schools and the parents of the children in the schools that your children or grandchildren go to, and make sure that the schools do that. Make sure that the churches that you attend, or the First Nations governments, or the Inuit communities, or the Métis villages that you live in, also commit to doing what we tell them they must do, because we have calls to action that are addressed to everybody. Work with your municipalities. We have calls to action which tell municipal governments what to do, what we think they should do, and how they can commit to doing things differently in the future. Whatever it is that you do, make sure that you never stop doing it. Not because it's going to benefit you necessarily. It's like planting a tree. If you plant a tree today, you may never see its fully grown state, but those who come behind you will. And it's for them that we are doing this. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And may God bless all of you for the work that you're going to do.
Good evening. Justice Mary Sinclair has agreed to take questions from the audience. There are microphones on both sides. If you have a question, please come to the nearest microphone. I have one important request, though. Please limit your comments to a minimum. I am sure there are many people with questions, so this is really important that you limit your comments. So there are 2 microphones. Please do come to the microphone for your questions.
While you're thinking of that, can I make a comment? My granddaughter is currently writing a speech. She's 9 years old. She's in a French immersion program. She has to write a speech in French, so I'm helping her do that. And so she said to me after she had read her speech to me, Mushum, she said, how do I make them stand up like you do when you're finished speaking? And I said, it's easy, my girl. You have to talk for a long time. And by the time you're done, they need to get up and stretch themselves.
I think she was, but...
It's all right, we'll take turns.
All right. Hi. Hello, Honourable Justice Sinclair. We've met. We had the opportunity to have you invited to deliver an address to the Saskatchewan School Board Association, the AGM, a few years ago, and I want to thank you again. We still talk about that presentation. When you met with us, and you met every trustee in Saskatchewan, all 28 boards that were in that room, 267 of them, you had given a challenge out there to all the divisions, and this is the public's division, to make it a priority and have the curriculum include the Indian residential school legacy. The interim report that came out, one of those recommendations in the back of that report was to have that Indian residential school apology be posted in every educational institution in Canada. In Saskatchewan, that's one of the priorities that we have embarked on. This is just a comment. Out of the schools, the provincial system, 28 boards, 90% of those boards have that apology posted within their facility. And 75% of our provincial schools in the province of Saskatchewan have that apology posted within their school. And a lot of them have been taking on wonderful ceremonies to make note of that apology and how it really brings in the community. So I just wanted to let you know on that. We are embarking on and looking at the recommendations as it relates to the education piece coming from the Saskatchewan School Boards Association. and embarking on a project where we would like to, or will be, advocating to the ministry to have that piece of history included in the curriculum. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
It's always good to hear about the work that's being done at the local community level to ensure that people are being properly educated, and in particular the area around curriculum materials and what's being done. Universities are really pulling a lot of that load too, because I know that here at the University of Regina, a lot of work is being done to ensure that Indigenous students and Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous efforts are being supported to ensure that this institution, along with other institutions in the country, through the work of your president, are committed to the field of reconciliation and committed to ensuring that reconciliation is advanced. University presidents, shortly after our release of the calls to action in June of last year, got together and made a commitment, a formal commitment as a group of presidents to ensure that their institutions would work towards ensuring that their academic institutions were positive places of education and learning, and University of Regina is doing its fair share of that too. So my commendation and congratulations to the University of Regina for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor, very much for your personal comments. I enjoyed them very much, hearing about your own childhood. I was a teenager before I found out that my mother was part Cree, and so I appreciated hearing some of the personal shame that goes with the Indigenous peoples. I had the opportunity a few years ago to hear the Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee from Liberia. And I'm wondering how many other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions you looked at and how they influenced what you were able to do in your own commission work.
There is an international organization called the International Center for Transitional Justice in New York City. It works as part of it's got a relationship with the United Nations, and they were instrumental in helping to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And they provided us with a lot of information about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, and the fact that there had been, at the time the creation of TRC Canada occurred, there had been about 64 TRCs all around the world, and they helped us to understand what the impact of those TRCs were, why they were successful and why they weren't successful, and what lessons we could learn from that. And so, for example, one of the issues that we had to address early on was how could we have the greatest impact when we released our calls to action upon the Canadian public so that no government could ignore our calls to action. And so when you saw us roll out the calls to action in the way that we did, it was because in June of last year, we believed that the government of that time would not implement any of our calls to action. And so we called upon the Canadian public to do it. And since June of last year, the Canadian public has embraced many of our calls to action, such that the federal government could have sat back and done nothing, and yet there would have been tremendous change in this society, so that ultimately they would have had to come along anyway. And as I say, on October the 19th of last year, they made another decision. So. There's just the two microphones, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Justice Sinclair.
Hi.
My name is Isabel, and I'm a third-generation survivor, residential school survivor. My mother, my grandmother attended residential school as well as me. I want to thank you, first of all, for the work that you've done, with the Truth and Reconciliation. And I'm really proud, that you were able to step up and do that work for us. And you and your committee have done a superb job. My question to you is, I work at Moose Jaw Sask Polytech, and we'd like to have one of the speakers come and talk to us. I've been doing some work around reconciliation and educating my colleagues about what they need to know, in my humble opinion. And I'd really like somebody to attend, so I'm just wondering, how can I do that?
Well, you could get in front of a microphone and ask me. You're one of those sneaky Cree women, right?
Actually, I'm Cree Soto.
See me before we leave. I'll give you an email address. We were establishing a speakers bureau through the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Commission for each province, because as you can imagine, there's only 3 of us as commissioners, and now the TRC is over. We don't have resources to be able to fly around the country, and we have to rely upon the kindness of strangers to be able to take on events. So we're looking at, we have speakers in each jurisdiction across the country to be able to respond to speaking invitations, and so we can give you a list of names, or if one of the commissioners is available, then we'll provide you with that contact information as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Next time you come to a microphone, I'm going to ignore you, okay?
Welcome, Justice Sinclair. I have actually 2 questions. I'm a Métis woman. I've worked in education for over, almost 30 years. And one of my questions is, with the Truth and Reconciliation, the Métis people were not necessarily represented the same way as treaty and status people were. Will there be something where they will be able to be heard on a greater platform as a follow-up to what has happened with the Truth and Reconciliation? And then my second question is, I know that there were, when residential schools were being phased out, the children were still being sent to residential schools, which were quote unquote called day schools, and they too suffered injustices and were not given the same platform or heard in the same way as the others. And the compensation, there was no consideration for compensation for those that suffered in the day schools, which were, what do I want to say, the transition stage of phasing out residential schools. So will there be something in that regard?
Okay, thank you. The Métis case and the day school issue are 2 very important issues, and we discuss them in our report. And in fact, we have a volume, one of our volumes, we have a 6-volume report. One of the volumes is about the Métis and residential schools that we devoted some time to. So we make mention of the situation that they're faced and why they were excluded as far as we could understand, and that they shouldn't have been excluded because there was no good reason. They went to residential schools run almost exactly the same as the schools for First Nations children, and therefore there's no reason why they should have been ignored. We tried to be careful about not jeopardizing the Métis lawsuit. There's a lawsuit that's being started for the Métis students who went to other residential schools that are not listed in the settlement agreement. And so we didn't want to say anything that would jeopardize that lawsuit. So our comments were generic in that area. But what we did say was that there's no reason why they should have to go through litigation in order to be able to establish the validity of their claim, because they were treated exactly the same as the First Nations students, and as long as the evidence that they can compile for purposes of negotiation can establish that, that should all be resolved through a mediation process. And that's the same as well for the day school students. They shouldn't have to go to court, because the government's position is they will not take responsibility for Métis students and day school students because the government would only take responsibility for residences that they themselves ran. And that is no reason for them to be excluded.
Well, thank you very much. And you swore my sister in Winnipeg as a lawyer many years ago.
Is she still a lawyer?
Yes, she is.
But it worked, eh? Okay.
Yes, it did.
Good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Honourable Sinclair. My name is Simon Moccasin. I just want to say thank you for coming to Treaty 4 here. Acknowledge the creator as well here, the good creator. I'm a survivor of the 60 scoop. It's been a long, arduous journey to get to this point. I was also part of that Maclean's magazine article that just came out. My question is, when dealing with powers that be, how do you go about organizing locally to, I don't know, I've been hitting walls, you know, and I know Regina here, our police chief said, hey, there's no racism in the police force. That's a lie. Try to talk to the mayor too, doesn't want to talk. So here we are, we're in this day and age. Under good faith, the treaties were made. Under good faith, I met with the police chief. And under good faith, we weren't supposed to talk about the meeting that we had. He said that he apologized, but he didn't. He only said, I'm sorry for how you feel. So I've been getting that. Yeah, I'm sorry for how you feel, but not what we did. And what happened is, I do have everything here. I'd like to give it to you afterwards about the case that I went through. So basically it was a case of police brutality and racial profiling. It's all in there. So I'm just saying, like, you know, to go forward, how do we go forward? Like, I know about forgiveness. I know what you're talking about, but we struggle with that. We have post-traumatic stress disorder. There's people here in the audience. That guy, I won't say who it is, okay. But there is really, you know, that's the thing, we have our humor to get us through. But there are a lot of survivors here right now, you know, but there's nothing being talked about in Regina. It's all been swept under the rug. I'm just trying to ask, like, how do we go forward here? And thanks for coming, by the way.
Okay. If you want, you can give me your papers. I'm not going to be able to do much with them because I'm no longer involved in a commission that does that kind of work, of course. But I'll be glad to look at them. And I can't give you any advice because I'm a judge. And and I have to be careful about what I say. As you saw tonight, I'm very careful about what I say. So right? You're my witnesses, right? But that being said, I know a little bit about your case because of the media material that has been circulated. And I agree with you that it looks like there is a resistance to acknowledging that there's a problem. And that's the first issue. The first problem is to admit there's a problem, and when there's no admission, then you've got a problem. A bigger problem than you had at the beginning. So you have a room full of people here, and I imagine that there are probably people here that might be willing to sit down and work with you to figure out a strategy to address that, because the best strategy is going to involve both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities coming together to address it, to fix it. And so I think that's what you have to figure out, how to do that. And I'll say that among our calls to action as well, we have called for the creation of a National Council for Reconciliation. And that National Council for Reconciliation, in our view, would have as a mandate the ability to monitor what governments are doing, including municipal governments and churches as well, what they're doing about reconciliation and what they're doing about those situations such as you're presenting, where instances of racism are raised and are not being properly addressed. And so I think the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation that has that kind of heft, that kind of weight, that ability to bring to both the public attention as well as the government's attention when things need to be done would be a useful entity to support the creation of. But just by show of hands here, how many of you would be prepared to help work with this gentleman to try to address this with the city? Imagine that there are people here. There, you got a room full of people here.
Much love.
All right.
Much love, thank you. And then that would also pertain to the 60 scoop, because that's coming down the pipe next as well, so, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Good luck.
Good evening, Justice Sinclair. I taught briefly in La Loche, Saskatchewan, where they had that tragedy.
Yes.
I want to tell you, the best article I read was from the National Post. He said, it is time, Canada, we have an original sin with the First Nations people. It's time that was addressed. Who's got the gonads? Who to deal with this, to have adult conversations and move forward from here, and let's start talking about some substantial issues. And so the young gentleman that just came up to speak, I was going to ask you, what can we do? How can we make this right? Like, how can we move forward? But he spoke before me, so I'm going to try to get together with him, because this has to stop. And I apologize to you on behalf of white people that I never knew for all the hardships. I apologize to every one of my First Nations brothers and sisters. I had no idea. My daughter attends university here. She came home and told me they used to put pins in their tongues when they spoke their language in residential school. I was horrified. So anyway, I thank you for coming tonight, and I will get together with that young man. And what I had wanted to ask you was, if you could tell, we have a new Prime Minister, if you could tell him, what can we do? We want to move in a new direction now. We want to move forward. What can we do to do that? Or do we just start at the local level, like with this young man here who came up to speak? How do we move forward now?
Well, first of all, the words of the Prime Minister that he's uttered from the day of election to this point in time have been very positive words, and it's been a very positive message, and I think it's a good start. But the reality is that words have to move into action, and so the real question now is going to be, what are the actions that are going to come with those words? And I think that's the key. One of the unfortunate things, and I'll use that word because I can't think of another word, one of the unfortunate things following the apology that was issued in 2008 was that I listened to the apology, and I was in a room full of survivors listening to the apology, and I saw the impact that the apology had that was issued by the Prime Minister at that time to residential school survivors. And the impact of the words of that apology were significant, and I think they were heartfelt by the Prime Minister of the day. I think he meant the words. Unfortunately, he didn't implement the apology in a significant way. And one of the first things that needed to be done with that apology was there had to be a message given to the public service of this country that that apology is meaningful, and that apology now must be lived up to. And in the same way, there has to be a message that goes through the civil servants, to the civil servants and throughout the civil service, that the words of the Prime Minister in which he talks about a nation-to-nation relationship now have to be respected. And everything the government does from this point forward has to be measured against the question of whether or not it will contribute to the establishment of a nation-to-nation relationship. And if it does not, then stop doing it. And incidentally, my condolences to all of the people of La Loche for that incident. I found it very difficult to listen to as I heard it. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Honourable Sinclair. My name is Joseph Mburu. I'm a professor in the Political Science and International Studies Department. I have basically two questions, very short ones. You tried to address one that has international connection. But in 2005, the late president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, went to the Italian parliament, addressed the Italian parliament regarding historical injustices. And they had a long conversation after that. There has been other attempts for addressing historical injustices across Africa. I was born in Africa myself. Maybe from a different jurisdiction, the country had a similar experience, like the First Nations here. I wasn't privileged, for example, to have an auntie myself, because my grandfather was castrated during the British rule, and my grandmother was beaten. She could not give birth again after giving birth to my mom. And that was a scenario across Kenya. So there were those kind of historical injustices. I think those who were affected in the last 10 years, I think they have been before the British courts asking for compensation and an apology. Now, so there has been this kind of scenarios that have been going around the world. I think West Africa may be the only region that has not maybe made those kind of complaints to either France or maybe Britain or Germany and all that. I'm wondering whether the Canadian government is taking note of some of these developments in those particular regions in regard to taking further actions, maybe the actions that you have mentioned in your report, and as to whether it is going to address those things, given again the development that is going on at the international level. The second question is, do you think maybe the democratic practice that possibly that is practiced across the world, not just in Canada, where sometimes the minorities don't have a strong say, could be a downside, or maybe what has affected, say, for example, the formation of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada here, where possibly the First Nations, being a minority, may not have a greater political clout, and therefore could there be an issue which needs to be addressed in terms of democratic practice that we have, not just in Canada, but of course across the world?
Let me deal with the second question first, because the first question is really something I'm not capable of answering, because you're really asking me to comment on government intention, and I have no idea what the government's likely to do. So in short, that's what I would probably tell you. But in a democratic society, I think there's room for all of the institutions of a democracy to have a role to play in the evolution of reconciliation when it comes from particularly a history of colonialism or oppression. And in Canada, for example, I have said often, and I've written as well, that in my view, that one of the reasons why reconciliation, the reconciliation conversation about residential schools advanced as quickly and as far as it did before the creation of the settlement agreement and the TRC was because of court decisions rendered by judges of this country on the issue of the treatment of Indigenous people and the rights of Indigenous people, and the recognition the courts gave to their pre-existing sovereignty, and the fact that reconciliation has to include a place for their pre-existing sovereignty in this day and age. And so those court decisions, I think, had a lot of influence upon the thinking of leading members of society, not necessarily within government, but some within government, but leading members of society when it came ultimately to the work of our commission and the impact that our commission was going to have. Because by the time the Chilcotin case came down from the Supreme Court of Canada, which recognized the validity of a legal title in the hands of First Nations people to territory outside of their reserve, outside of their proven occupancy area, recognizes that there's a lot more to the discussion than the government was prepared to say. So every society, in order to be able to advance the cause of reconciliation, needs to ensure that all of its institutions, all of its democratic institutions, including the court system, and maybe especially the court system, takes the steps necessary to protect the minorities within its society, to ensure that their continued oppression is brought to a stop using proper legal techniques to do that. Okay, thank you.
We are running out of time. Please limit your comments so that we can take further questions.
Thank you. I'll try to be fairly brief. I just want to first of all thank you for your work on the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, and I was working as a Native Studies teacher in Brandon, Manitoba, with a lot of students from northern Manitoba, and I'll say that your work was foundational to a lot of Indigenous rights in the prairies, and I want to thank you deeply for that. I also would like to ask a question about public record and the fact that the TRC hearings, etc., the survivor stories have become part of the public record. I'm concerned about the 38,000 or whatever cases that are involved in the ADR and the independent assessment process that are not part of the public record, and that very few of those will be part of the public record. And I think those stories have a different story in the sense of the relationship that's also part of it, in the relationship of the Crown, of the Church, of the survivors. And I'd like to hear what you have to say in terms of the possibility that that can become public.
Well, we went to court in order to establish the right of the Commission to receive those testimonies and to protect them for the future, subject to the privacy rights of those who were part of those hearings. It was never our intention to make any of those statements automatically available to the public, in that those who wish to protect their statements from public viewing would have their wishes respected. That was always our position. But that being said, we felt it was important that until the privacy interests of those individuals expired, or after those privacy interests had expired, that those documents should be available for future generations to be able to see what went on in the schools, because they are the richest source of information about abuse that occurred in residential schools. And the government agrees with us, interestingly, and wants to maintain them. But there are forces at play who are trying to destroy all of those records, and they should not be allowed to destroy those records, because they will create a huge gap in our national memory. So that ultimately, as I said, in 100 years from now, people will be able to say, nobody got abused, where's the record of abuse? And it's because the statements of the victims of abuse will have been destroyed by those who want to destroy them, those in the churches who want to destroy them, and those who represent individuals who want to destroy information should not be allowed to win the day. There's now a Court of Appeal decision in Ontario that's being waited upon, and I think the Court of Appeal of Ontario will rule, and I suspect that they will allow the documents to be protected in some way going forward, and that's my wish.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Vince LaValle. I am a teacher at Scott Collegiate. I just got a comment and a question. The comment is, I appreciate the government trying to indigenize our classrooms, but the question for you is, how do we teach our students, or how do we teach our students to embrace the history of the TRC, but to eliminate the factors from them succeeding?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part.
How do we embrace the history of the TRC to our students, but also eliminate the factors that keep them from succeeding?
I don't see a connection there, so maybe you can help me.
So what I'm doing is a unit on TRC. How do we get them to embrace the history of it, trying to eliminate the racism, trying to eliminate the drugs and alcohol from them succeeding in the classroom, our everyday life?
Oh, I think it's because I don't understand your first, I think what you're talking about is the history of colonialism and oppression in the country, not the TRC.
Okay.
History of the TRC is only 5 years long,
Yeah.
right?
So how do we embrace that to our students in the classroom?
You don't have to embrace anything. I'm not sure what you mean by embrace, but I think you need to understand it. I think you need to study it and understand the impact of it, and realize that there is a reason why things are the way they are, and those reasons do not include inferiority. So it's not because Indigenous people are inferior that we have these social problems, because of the manufactured poverty and social conditions that they have to live with today.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Justice Sinclair. I grew up on a farm in about a 95% Ukrainian area, and we went through a similar process. My grandparents probably never went to school here. They emigrated, never went to school here. My parents' generation went to school and had similar kinds of conditions that you're talking about. By the time I went to school in the 50s, there were still quite a number of the students who spoke Ukrainian before they came to school, couldn't speak English. But within about 5 years with television, very quickly that changed. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, how do you evaluate the force of the media, which is constantly trying to give us a different impression than what you're presenting?
You're supposed to keep it an easy question. The media has played a significant role in bringing the issues forward so that people are able to understand a bit about what's been going on, but to a large extent as well, the media has played a role in the oppression of Indigenous people. For example, we have uncovered in the records of the government numerous letters to the editors of the national newspapers, the Globe and Mail, for example, and to other media outlets across the country, complaining about the way that children are being abused in residential schools. And yet when we look at the headlines and the columns that are written and the news reports that are written in the day, we do not see anything written about the abuse that was going on in residential schools by any media outlet before the 1950s. And yet they knew what was going on, and they collaborated with the government to suppress those stories and to deny access to that information for the public. So the media has been implicated in the denial of public knowledge about residential schools. And there's an interesting book called Seeing Red, which talks about the treatment of Indigenous people by the media in Canada, that I commend to everybody to read, because it does talk about the role of racism in media reporting. And I think it's an important piece of information. That needs to change, obviously. And with the centralization of so many media outlets, particularly the newspaper outlets, into one entity, I don't have a lot of faith that we can rely upon one media to continue to provide us with a fair and balanced reporting system. But my view always is, so long as we have the internet, we have a source of information there that will continue to ensure that, at least to a certain extent, some of that information will be able to get out there.
Thank you.
So, I'm in your hands.
Thank you. I'm sorry you have been waiting, but we have run out of time, but there will be refreshments after the event, so Justice Murray Sinclair will be available if you have questions. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speaker, the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, for delivering the 2016 Woodrow Lloyd Lecture. As a token of our appreciation, I would like to present this big box with a small gift in it to you. I will help you carry it later. It is heavy. I hope you will enjoy it. In this historical moment in which the most urgent task for all Canadians is the difficult work of reconciliation, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has helped to create a path forward for every one of us. We hope that this lecture has made at least a small contribution toward realizing the recommendations of the Commission. I would like to thank Acting Dean Dr. Thomas Bredol and Dr. James Daschuk for their comments tonight. And of course, I would also like to thank Elder Noel Starblank for leading us in prayer. I thank the elders present for being in attendance and would like especially to acknowledge the survivors of the residential school system with us tonight. Your courage is what will drive the public work of reconciliation forward. Our thanks also go to the representatives from the university here tonight and the many people who have contributed to the success of tonight's event. Our gratitude is first and foremost to the generous support of the Woodrow Lloyd Trust Fund. I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture Committee, including Dr. Claire Polster, Dr. Michelle Stewart, and myself, Dr. Nignan, their Acting Associate Dean of Arts. And I would like to thank especially Milagros Cherries, who has worked so hard to put this event together, and also several other events associated with this lecture. She has done a lot for this event. Finally, I thank you all for coming, and I would like to invite you all to join us for refreshments in the lobby. The University of Regina Alumni Association is happy to co-sponsor these refreshments, and we encourage all alumni who are with us this evening to enter their names into the door prize draw, also located in the refreshments area. Please, you are welcome to hang around in the lobby for refreshments, and thank you all for coming, and good night.